Boğaziçi TV'den herkese merhabalar. Bu akşam serbest yazının etkinliğini ekranlarınıza getiriyor olacağız. Serbest yazının siyaset bilimi ve antropoloji profesörü James Scott'ı ağırlıyor. Demokratik direniş üzerine açık dersiyle birlikte daha sonra ekranlarınızda olacak. Ondan öncesinde Boğaziçi Üniversitesi Politika bölümünde görevli doçent doktor Zeynep Kadir Beyoğlu açılış konuşmasını gerçekleştirecek. Açık dersin ardından da soru cevaplarla etkinlik tamamlanacak. İsterseniz şimdi etkinliğe bağlanalım.
Sorry for the delay and I'm starting now, excuse me. A serbest yazın free literature in English, which cares about and struggles for a democratic and free university environment with the motto that the academy does not obey. We are involved in the resistance from an academic framework in order to create an alternative academy. And nowadays, we continue to organize open lectures as part of Pride Month events. In these days, when we are going through processes such as the closure of the LGBTI plus studies club, the detention of our friends who carry rainbow flags, and the opening of an investigation against them, we as free literature in Turkish serbest yazın demonstrate that our existence, colors, and identity are far beyond these and that our visibility will not be denied in any area of life, nor will we be denied in academia, with events we will organize during the month Pride. Finally, we don't see the appointment which an invasion and disrespect to our rights, culture, and autonomy as legitimate, and we ignore the efforts to fade our colors, and we continue to exist with all our colors in every field. Finally, I want to introduce James Scott, and we will go on with the Professor Zeynep Kadir Beyoğlu. James Scott is the Sterling Professor of Political Science and Professor of Anthropology and is co-director of the Agrarian Studies program and a mediocre farmer. His research concerns political economy, comparative agrarian societies, theories of hegemony and resistance, political politics, peasant politics, revolution, Southeast Asia, theories of class relation, and anarchism. If you have any question to James Scott, you can send them to ask me, Ebrar Neville, and we will listen to dear Zeynep Kadir Beyoğlu now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm really delighted to have Professor Scott here with us. I have read his work since my graduate school days and inspired by his work. What I would like to do is to give a very brief introductory comments what I would like to highlight is that what's going on at the university today at Boğaziçi University is actually a remnant of the 1980 coup and the military regime that had established the Higher Education Board, which is supposed to control the universities rather than coordinate them. So the universities and students are seen as kind of security threats or seen through the security lens, which over the years with the democratization that began in the 1980s and 90s had sort of, was, let's say, diminished. And Boğaziçi was always quite innovative in terms of enlarging the type jacket that this organization had put over the universities. But what we see, especially in the last decade, is a serious erosion of democracy in Turkey, a kind of democratic backsliding, if you will. And the freedom of speech and freedom of objection are severely limited in today's Turkey. And what we observe at Boğaziçi University is not peculiar to us. This has been going on in other universities, what we have experienced with the appointment of a rector since January 2nd is a major blow to the principles of democratic governance that Boğaziçi University Senate had accepted in 2012. So we are seeing that our red lines are being, crossed over by various attempts to control the way the university is governed. And we are objecting to this, both the faculty members, students, alumni, both in Turkey and abroad. And we are hoping to maintain academic freedoms and to strive for university autonomy, not just for Boğaziçi, but for universities across Turkey, because we know that in the absence of academic freedom, we actually lose collectively. So today we are delighted to have James Scott, and as someone who analyzed different forms of resistance, we are looking forward to hearing your views on democratic resistance, but also maybe at the end you could tell us a bit about your own experience I had read in an interview that you had began your career during the Vietnam War, and that you were in the midst of demonstrations, giving talks and lectures on that phenomenon. So maybe you could also give us a bit of your own experiences with respect to resistance at university. So with that, I would like to give the floor or the screen to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be asked to give a talk at Boğaziçi University. I've known a fair amount about it historically, and I know its important place in academic freedom and in autonomy. And I am cognizant of the struggle that you have been undertaking for a long time to preserve that autonomy and freedom of inquiry. And Zeynep said, this is not just important for you, but it's a resource for the whole society, for the appreciation of its history, of the major issues that face it, that most politicians, even in a democratic society, are likely to want to avoid. There's always been a tension between universities and even a democratic society. And of course, that tension is enormously amplified in the case of an autocratic administration that wishes to control all inquiry and suppress all dissent. It seems to me that along with journalism, the universities are the last bastions in an autocracy of free and original thought, and that their suppression marks the end of any kind of public and open and allowed dissent and free thought. I thought it might be useful. My specialty for the last 8 or 10 years has been Burma and the Burmese language and Burmese culture. And I'm actually planning on writing a biography of the Irrawaddy River, which is the main river in Burma, but I will not bore you with those details. But the universities in Burma were domesticated, if I can use a polite expression, in the 1960s by the first military government. And Burma was, from 1962 until 2011, ruled completely by the army as a dictatorship, suppressing all dissent and engaging in wars with minority groups at the borders. And part of that military rule, which lasted, it's important to note, a half a century, right? We're talking 51 years, had profound effects on the university. You can say that the process was a process of the silent murder of the university as an institution of free inquiry. The administration, university was administrated increasingly by appointees, obedient appointees of the dictators. Its degrees could actually be bought and were worth nothing in terms of actual scientific or social scientific inquiry. Any topic that was thought to be dangerous or subversive was forbidden, and as you might expect, almost any topic that even hinted at dissent and a dissenting view of Burmese history was forbidden. The real scholars left the university or retired or were fired. And the other thing, which is actually important to note, I think, in terms of world university history, is that there was also an effort to redistribute and disperse universities away from city centers, from downtown areas all over the world. You know, the Paris 1, 2, 3, after the 1960s, and the Berkeley free speech movement, for example, there was this effort to disperse universities in rural areas, unpopulated areas where they would not contaminate and mix with the population. The same is true after Tiananmen Square. It's true in Paris, and it was true in Burma, a whole series of dispersed universities in the countryside in which you have to take a bus to your classes and then a bus back that is not even a residential facility. It was an effort, in a sense, to atomize the university population and the intelligentsia, and it was, by and large, rather successful. The result was that if you went to Burma and were looking for intellectuals, the very last place you would look is the university. With respect to intellectuals, it was a cemetery. If you wanted to connect with intellectuals, as I did, you had to go to the tea shops. I call this the tea shop intelligentsia. It was the last forum. This would be the cafe in other societies. It was the last forum for free exchange of information, and even that was constrained because military informers were thought to be dispersed throughout the population, and people were relatively careful unless they were among close friends. Today now, after I'm sure you have heard of the military coup in Burma on February 1st. We're now well past 100 days of that coup. More than 850 demonstrators have been shot, many of them execution style by military snipers and so on. Many of those intellectuals are either in hiding or are in detention or have fled to Chiang Mai, fled to the Thai border, where they hope to be both protected by armed ethnic groups that are opposed to the military government, and also to go to Chiang Mai as a temporary refuge. So many of the Burmese intellectuals seem to be accumulating now in Chiang Mai, outside the country, if you like, an exile intelligentsia. I wanted to make 2 points and end on a, perhaps for me, uncharacteristically optimistic note. It seems to me, as I read it, and of course, I'm very careful not to talk much about the future generally, because none of us know what's going to happen. We're unprepared for anything, basically. But there are two trends that in the last decade or so seem to me to be interesting to observe and understand. The one of them that you are experiencing, and we experienced with President Trump, is a populist nationalist autocracy. And under these populist nationalist autocracies, I think one of the most important things to understand is that they retain a democratic institutional facade. And it's interesting to understand that the legitimacy of democracy is so embedded in much of the world that this facade is a necessary mask that is worn by these autocracies. Yes, there are courts, there are elections, there are candidates, there are parties, there are even campaigns, but they are generally without content. They are emptied of substantive value. The law is used to harass and bankrupt dissidents. This is the way the soft authoritarianism of the Singaporean government, for example, operates. They don't imprison many people, but they ruin them by defamation suits and a whole series of legal maneuvers that strips them of wealth, makes them spend all their time in the courts, subjects them to fines and often to periods of imprisonment. And that soft authoritarianism is in fact what many authoritarian regimes are aiming for, so that they don't have to use the hard instruments of coercion, but can maintain the facade without any of the practical inconveniences of having a real opposition. So these autocratic dictatorships operate necessarily with the mask of democratic institutions, the laws, the trials, right? But these are institutions that have been thoroughly domesticated. In the case of universities, the appointment of your own rector, of his advisors, and a whole series of changes that, although they represent the, if you like, the structure of university autonomy, are no longer autonomous at all. This is characteristic of Jerzy Orbán. It's characteristic of Burma's junta. It's characteristic of the Thailand junta, of Kaczynski in Poland. And this is the objective of Narendra Modi in India as well, to actually eliminate the autonomy of the courts and of the universities. So that is the, if you like, the pessimistic trend of how successful autocratic regimes have been at maintaining an empty, contentless democratic facade. The other thing, which is a source of some hope, I think, is that we have seen in the last several years massive, creative, brave, and extremely popular democratic movements. I don't know how closely Turkish newspapers reported on the Hong Kong student uprising, which involved the entire civil population by and large. It was crushed, yes, but it was an extraordinary, the umbrella movement and the whole series of creative maneuvers by the students, which still continue under draconian conditions and with some of these people exiled. Yes, the movement was crushed, but it was, I think, the most creative, massive democratic movement we have seen in many, many decades. And it went on for months and months and months. If anything, the democratic movement in Burma is even more impressive. Of course, I'm not talking about, I could talk about Belarus as well, which is a striking example of another massive democratic movement that was crushed. In Burma, the February coup resulted within just a few days of a massive outpouring of opposition to military rule. And remember that Burma had only had something like 10 years, less than 10 years of quasi-democratic openness with a relatively free journalism, social media, and independent radio and TV stations, all of which have been crushed now. But what's extraordinary is that after half a century of autocracy, in the short space of simply 10 years, you created a constituency for democratic rule that extended throughout the entire Burmese country, not just Rangoon, not just Mandalay, not just the big cities, but in villages, in small provincial towns. Much of the resistance now, in terms of flash mobs and demonstrators, takes place in quite out of the way places. So the extraordinary thing is that this is not confined to a narrow intelligentsia affiliated with universities and schools in the major urban conglomerations, but it appears to be, and empirically it is, a movement that is nationwide, and if anything, is supported massively by people who are between 15 years old and 30 years old. This young generation who, if you like, came of age in this brief democratic opening. You had something like 50% of all the teachers resigning to participate in the civil disobedience movement. The same for nurses, for doctors, for railway workers, for clerks, and even some police as well. And the kinds of resistance that have been conducted are themselves so varied that anyone can participate at one level or another, even if they're quite afraid of the repercussions if they are identified. That is to say, there are many ways in which you can avoid being identified. So the most striking thing is at 8 o'clock every night, the banging of pots and pans all throughout Burma, in every urban area, which is a sign against the military rule. And because it's often done behind closed windows and doors and so on, it is a form of protest in which people can engage without immediate risk of harm to themselves or arresting. The flash mobs that originate at 6 or 7 a.m. in many cities and in villages, and that disappear the moment that the military or the police appear. You have also a massive process of shaming, so that when families of the rather like, I guess, Boğaziçi, the Erdogan and Boğaziçi, is that in 6 months, everything will calm down and people will accept the reality of military rule. It appears so far that that has not happened. And in fact, the regime seems to be losing both some elements of the police and military and many of their once stalwart professors, supporters, because they think that the junta cannot last given the massive popularity of the opposition to it. I don't know, nobody knows how this will turn out, but one has to be unbelievably inspired by the bravery and persistence and endurance and creativity in terms of forms of resistance against the regime, which include minimal things like not going to school. That's a kind of, if you like, withdrawal of civic participation from an institution that is now hated and seen to be an instrument of the military government. Most of my work on resistance actually took place some time ago, so I hesitate to refer to it, but it's worth mentioning that what struck me when I was working on forms of peasant resistance is the way in which there are many forms of resistance that can take place that are undeclared and therefore relatively safer than declared open formal resistance. We tend to think of social movements of resistance as having a name, maybe a flag, of having officers, of having marches and demonstrations of open declared opposition. Most, of course, in autocratic regimes and in non-democratic settings, and in all those settings where opposition may be likely to get you killed or put in jail or beaten, people have devised other forms of resistance that are relatively safer for them, and yet in aggregate have an enormous effect on the direction of the society over time. So what I'm going to do just briefly is to compare different forms of formal opposition as opposed to informal, practical, undeclared opposition. So for example, if we are talking about land and claims to land, then squatting, I don't know how that's translated into Turkish, it's quietly taking over a property that you believe belongs to you, but not making any legal claim, not making any public declaration, and often retreating when the police and army come, and then a few days later, moving back when the police and army leave. So squatting is, if you like, a claim to land without an open declaration of defiance. And it should be compared to what also occurs in safer settings, which is a land invasion with flags and demonstrations and a formal claim to property rights. So squatting doesn't claim property rights. It's happy with de facto gains that can be kept, right? If you're thinking of, let's say, the right of hunters and gatherers and foragers, then poaching, which is to say the so-called illegal invasion of land to take firewood and game and so on, is a quiet way of resisting aristocratic, in England, a quiet way of resisting claims to land and to the rights of the fish and game and wood that is on that land. So from 1650 to 1850, in England, the most common crime, and by common, I mean both most numerous and most loved, was poaching. And yet there were no formal claims to hunting rights against the aristocracy, no formal claims to fishing rights, no formal claims to the collection of firewood. It happened massively and quietly, and we know that it was, if you like, supported by the peasantry, because the regimes, the aristocratic regimes in all parts of England, found it almost impossible to ever get someone to give evidence against other villagers for such poaching, right? So that it was, if you like, it had a legitimacy about the rights to open land that couldn't be declared openly, and yet it was the most significant struggle over property rights for 2 centuries in England. When it comes to military service, of course, that's often critical. The informal, undeclared form of resistance is desertion. And that is to be distinguished from mutiny, which is the arresting of your officers and the declaration of the dissolution of the army. If you want to understand the collapse of the South in the Civil War, there are, in the United States, there are 2 things that are crucial to it that often are not emphasized enough. One is the running away of slaves to the north and to the swamps and so on during the Civil War, when it was easier to do this, run away to the Union lines to fight for the North. But what was absolutely decisive is the fact that 1/3, after the fighting got to be difficult, something like 1/3 of the Confederate troops deserted. And when they deserted, it was not a mutiny. They just took their arms and went back to the hills from which they came, and they could not be reconscripted for the rest of the war. And that was a crippling blow to the Confederacy, and it was not as if these deserters were proponents of the abolition of slavery or against segregation and so on. It is simply that these were, by and large, whites who did not own slaves themselves. And although they would fight for the Confederacy as long as it was easy, they were not going to lose their life to defend the property of the rich whites who had plantations. And so that's the point. When it got difficult, they just walked away. And much of the Confederacy was plagued by a lack of armed troops. I think I should stop there. Truancy, what we call truancy in America, from school is another form of resistance. There are all kinds of, to understand defection, if you like, from formal regulations is often to understand ways of undeclared affection. So that, for example, if you take the sacrament of marriage, it would be one thing in a Christian church to stand up and denounce the institution of marriage as a form of slavery, if you like. However, the defection as a practical matter takes place by partnerships that are never declared, that are never sanctified by marriage, that are extra institutional. So there is a massive, if you like, and increasingly in the West, massive non-compliance with formal relationships with marriage that is undeclared, and therefore doesn't constitute an open and public threat. And I should close because with this, that I understand that you're also celebrating gay rights or queer rights at this particular time at Boğaziçi. And it seems to me that in a sense, the relationships between gay people and lesbians and so on are relationships that have never been publicly sanctioned, that have been stigmatized, that have been made illegal, that have been made even criminal, and yet they take place all the time in a way that is not declared as open defiance, but is actually practiced. I think is that about a half an hour? Good. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, dear Professor. It was perfect to listen to you for this time. And I have a question. If you're ready, I want to ask it firstly. We have seen that the government reacts against a non-violent demonstration, non-violent and actually peaceful demonstration, with violence. This violence is mass violence, without considering what they're doing, just violence. What is the effect of this kind of reaction on social movements, democratic resistance? Does it weaken or strengthen the social and democratic movement in a general sense?
Could I ask you to repeat the question?
We have seen that the governments react against a non-violent and peaceful demonstration with violence. What is the effect of this kind of reaction by the government on the social movements? Does it weaken or strengthen the social movement in a general sense?
Actually, that's a wonderful question. Partly because the answer is complicated. So in the short run, it seems to me to be fairly obvious that if the government uses open coercion and violence to repress a public peaceful demonstration, it will, over time, prevent those demonstrations from happening because people are not willing to sacrifice their life merely to demonstrate. But what is interesting to me is that it shows the hand of a completely intolerant and autocratic and violent administration, so that over the long run, it lessens, diminishes radically its legitimacy. So while you may succeed in the short run of suppressing demonstrations, you are creating, if you like, you are creating the raw material for explosions of an even greater kind much later, because you are destroying any legitimacy that the government had. So, for example, why your question is relevant is because it's absolutely applicable to what is happening in Burma now. Before, the military regime in Burma was able to claim, or they assert, not all people believed it, but they asserted that they were responsible for holding the country together against those who would tear it apart, against Muslims, for example, the Rohingya, against the ethnic armed groups at the border. And as a result of their absolute unrestrained use of violence on completely peaceful crowds, they have completely undermined their legitimacy as protectors of the nation, and in fact characterized themselves as murderers of the nation. And Burmese who previously held some prejudices against minority groups at the frontier are now running to the frontier, supporting their claims for federal institutions that would guarantee the autonomy of the ethnic groups and actually getting training with armed groups in order to go back to the cities in order to fight the regime. So the roads are now blocked. And so these are people who never would have dreamed, I think, of taking up arms against the government. The result of the repression has sent them to the border in order to get trained by the groups you may not know, the Karen, the Kachin, the Chin, a lot of ethnic groups called so-called armed ethnic groups that have been conducting a rebellion against the government for the last 6 or 7 decades, actually, in many cases. And so they actually have trained military groups and autonomous areas. And now the Burman Democrats find themselves fleeing to these areas as areas of safe haven in order to get the kind of training to come back and oppose the military in the big cities like Rangoon and Mandalay.
Thank you for your kind answer. And we have a Ask Me person, Ask Me Ebrar Neville. You can ask your question to Ebrar. And Ebrar, do you have any question that we can ask to?
Yeah, thank you, dear Scott, for being here with us. And we have firstly a question about, as you mentioned, LGBTQI movements. He or she is saying in queer movements in Turkey, people are faced to an moral reaction against themselves. Can everyday forms of resistance used by queer people be a way to handle or destroy this kind of reaction for LGBTI plus movements? What do you think or suggest against this kind of morality-based reaction? That's the question.
Please repeat it somewhat more slowly.
Yeah, of course. They are asking that in queer movements in Turkey, people are faced to an moral reaction against themselves, against LGBTQI movements. There are moral reactions, morality-based reactions. Can everyday forms of resistance used by queer people be a way to handle or destroy this kind of reaction for LGBTI plus movements? What do you suggest against this kind of?
Can you describe to me the moral reaction directed against oneself and the form that it takes?
Yeah. Actually, in general, in Turkey, people are saying that being LGBT is against the human nature or human creature. It is immoral, and sometimes our official persons are saying they are deviants. And
I see.
Yeah, what can we do against this kind of reactions? Because they are attacking by saying you are immoral, you have to be changed, your sexual orientation.
Oh, I see. I understand. I understand your question. So it seems to me to be, in general, when you have, I'm going to go at this question in a roundabout way. Historically, when there is an insurrection or rebellion, and I'm talking about even medieval times in the West, the ruling elites are likely to describe this revolution or insurrection or rebellion as the work of bandits, of just thieves, right? Of people who want to loot and plunder, people who are immoral, etc., in many ways. And so the effort is always to castigate your enemies as people who are in one way or another, if you like, barbarians, uncivilized, atheists, sexually immoral, not reliable, crazy people, and so on. And it seems to me that the only way that that is countered and opposed is by the creation of a, like the gay pride movement, to embrace and include and celebrate these differences so that they are not seen as deviations, but they are seen as part of the fabric and composition of an inclusive society. And so that rather than these people, and in fact, as we used to characterize it as coming out of the closet, is an indication that people no longer felt so shamed that they had to hide their sexual orientation. So in the same way, for example, if you think of a strike in an industry, there is a war going on for popular opinion. The owners of the factory want to describe the strikers as troublemakers, communists, insurrectionists, whatever. On the other hand, the strikers want to describe the people who refuse to go on strike there in the factory as, in the English word, American word is scab, right? The thing that develops over a wound. And so there's an effort, in a sense, if you like, a public opinion effort within the factory workforce and within the community to decide whether the people on strike are people who are worthy and honorable and doing the right thing, as opposed to stigmatized, deviant, insurrectionists, barbarians, and so on. So the only way, it seems to me, to work against what you describe as, if you like, the moral stigmatization of dissidents, whether they be sexual dissidents or whether they be political dissidents, is to create a culture of inclusion and celebration and honor for these that is that grows quite powerful. And if that seems utopian, it's useful to remember that it's extraordinary. At least I remain to be instructed about the situation in Turkey, but in the United States, it's quite astounding how quickly, within 2 decades, lesbians and gay men and transgender people and queer people have been accepted and their rights recognized. And 2 decades ago, this would have seemed almost impossible. So you tell me, in a sense, how that happened had to do with a kind of cultural shift. And I'm impressed. I'm sure you've read about the Black Lives Matter movements after the murder of George Floyd. It was an extraordinary moment in which a lot of people got, for the first time in their life, an education of how the police treated Black people and have always treated Black people. And the fact that now it's recorded on video and camera and so on has made it, in a sense, unavoidable for people to confront and to sort of understand. And it seems to me there's been a sea change in the, I mean, there's opposition to it, but there's been a sea change in the view of what is correct police behavior with respect to racial minorities.
Thank you. And I have a hand. I see a hand. Ceren's hand.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Enes. I want to ask a question about Actually, we tried 6-day boycott during the first week of this semester for our 6 friends who were imprisoned for our classes, but students attended even mass lectures without roll call. Also, some academics didn't cancel the exams after the day of our 159 friends were detained. So in this atmosphere, now we are demanding to our professors to start an academic boycott, such as canceling finals, giving the highest grade for everyone, or don't enter the grades to the system and make our university functions useless. And what do you think about these academic boycotts?
I'm reluctant to give advice to people whose situation I don't know as well as I should. So, but one thing that I can say is the version of this that a long time ago in the Vietnam War I confronted was during the Vietnam War and the Cambodian invasion. We're talking about the 1960s and before most of you were born. And what was interesting to me is that I began with the idea that the university should just go on strike and the professor should refuse to teach, refuse to give exams, right? Until the police were called off and until people resisting conscription were freed. A friend of mine who was more wise than I said that if you just stop teaching, it allowed the authorities to just treat you as lazy bums who didn't want to work and who could take a few weeks off, right? And claim the moral high ground that they were supporting the opposition to the Vietnam War. And he said, what we must do is to do more teaching than we normally do, but to do it outside the institution of the university. And so we met in local churches, in community halls, in gymnasiums, and we carried on teaching, but outside the formal institution of the university, and also held, of course, a lot of forums and workshops on the Vietnam War itself. And of course, I'm a Southeast Asianist, so I was deeply involved in all of this. But what was interesting to me is that it's not a bad idea if you want to boycott an institution that has violated its mission, to have your form of protest be an affirmation of the real objectives and central objective of your institution itself, to do more teaching rather than less teaching, right? And so I think that whatever form, let's say, the resistance takes, and that may include, I don't know how education in prisons takes place in Turkey. It's quite a movement here now of offering of degrees to people who are actually detained over time. But it seems to me it does matter that opposition to the government has to think carefully about seizing the moral high ground from the authorities and making them seem better people, more dedicated to the values of society, to freedom and democracy, than the people who are repressing them. And that involves, if you like, extra work rather than less work.
Thank you. I think it was clear. And Ebrar, do we have any question now again?
Yeah, thank you, Enes. I want to ask one of questions from our audience. They are asking that firstly they thank you, Scott, dear Scott, and would Dear Scott, want to say anything about the effects of the Yellow Vest movement on France, and also if he has information about the Gezi resistance in 2013? Would he like to make a comparison between Yellow Vests and Gezi resistance, or I'm not sure between Gezi resistance and Boğaziçi resistance, because there are a lot of comparisons are going on about the similarity between Gezi resistance and Boğaziçi resistance. I don't know if you know enough.
The short answer is no. I don't know enough. And I don't know enough about the Yellow Vest resistance to Macron and the kind of issues that were involved. I know that what's interesting, given France's revolutionary history, is that there is, although the state is extremely strong and centralized, and so historically has been the educational system, by the way, that the resistance to state mandates in France is actually quite strong, and perhaps even stronger than it is in the United States in some respects. And so, for example, the proportion of people who refuse to get vaccinated against COVID-19 in France is a good deal higher than it is even in the United States. And so there's a, it seems to me that there's a opposition to centralization and state control in France that is not based on questions of freedom and autonomy, but which is just simply against forms of centralization. And my impression is that most of the Yellow Vests come from the right wing of the French political spectrum by and large, and that they represent, for those of us who have a memory of earlier French movements, the Poujadiste movement of shopkeepers against the French central government in the 50s and 60s. So I'm afraid I don't have much to offer in terms of the comparison of the Yellow Vests to the Boğaziçi, because I don't know enough about either.
Thank you. And do you have any time, or how many questions we can ask to you? James Scott. Can you hear me?
Can I hear you? Yes.
Do you have any time that we can go on for a question and answer
Oh,
part?
sure. I can answer a few more questions. Sure.
Okay, thank you. And I have a hand here, Şeyma-san.
Thank you coming here today. I want to ask this question. During protests in Boğaziçi, people were detained because they carried a rainbow flag representing LGBTI+ people. What do you think about criminalizing this kind of representing objects? Thank you.
Again, more slowly, please.
Sure. During protests in Boğaziçi, people were detained because they carried a rainbow flag representation LGBTI+ people. What do you think about criminalizing this kind of representing objects?
It's wrong and stupid. So what I find surprising is they were arrested simply for displaying the flag. Am I right? And
Yes,
I'm
you are.
wondering, I'm wondering what kind of law prevents you from flying a flag that represents, if you like, speech, what we would call First Amendment speech. It doesn't endanger anybody. It expresses an opinion. And why, I don't understand. I suppose that a law that permits you to arrest people for flying a flag that expresses an opinion about sexual orientation is a terrible undemocratic law and is against free speech in a fundamental way. So that's what I think about it. I mean, and it'd be interesting to me to know whether did such a law exist in the Republic as well. Was Kamal editor and his successors? Did they was the legal framework in place then that would have created the same penalty, or is this an Erdogan innovation?
It is I'm sorry, can you hear me? It was basically Erdogan's innovation because there is no law in our constitutional law saying you cannot be sexually oriented with LGBTQI characteristics. The law have to be equal for everyone, every citizen regarding their sexual orientation or anything they are belongs to their identities. It's basically Erdogan's and other officials' invention.
If you were to if civil rights lawyers were to challenge this in the courts, does Erdogan control the courts so successfully that it would be thrown out or would be rejected? Or is there a chance that one could win a legal settlement that would declare such laws unconstitutional? Now I'm asking the questions.
It is actually, it can be supported by lawyers that being LGBTQI is not criminal thing, and we can win the situation because there is no law saying that. It's just has to be defined, and insisting on this LGBTQI rights are lawyers think they can
Right.
do that. They can absolutely do that because there's no law saying the vice versa.
So it's worth going back to the question of, if you like, cultural struggle over these issues. And it's interesting to me, for example, in the history of civil rights, one of the key moments is what is called the Black is Beautiful moment, right? In which, rather than being stigmatized because of your skin color, you exercised a public pride, right? In having a black skin. And so it wasn't, if you like, a defiance of stigma and contempt by embracing that characteristic that was being criticized and stigmatized. In the same way, it seems to me the function of gay pride parades is to say, here we are in huge numbers, in large numbers, and we're marching and we're part of this society. And so that's part of the cultural struggle where people get used to it. It's sort of like overwhelming the opposition with a public show of pride and strength and numbers, in which do you want to start putting all gay people in prison? Well, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of us, and we're all marching peacefully. And it's an embarrassment for a government to do something like that. So there's a way of, if you like, reversing the stigma in a public display that it aims in the long run over changing the cultural dialogue. And then if you're successful, then stigmatizing LGBT people doesn't work anymore because everyone, right, thinks this is unjust and illegitimate. So, I mean, I understand that the cultural wars are, if you like, a long struggle, a long war that are not won overnight. But it seems to me those, once they are accomplished, they're likely to be permanent. It used to be true for women. Women didn't have citizenship, right? Now, right? So it seems to me that the history of incorporation of people in the human community, slaves, blacks, women, gay people, you know, if you like, the tent of humanity is constantly being expanded in terms of legal rights and, most important, cultural legitimation. Because it's not just about the law, it's also about public acceptance.
Thank you. And we have a question on the registration form. One of our audience asked this. I wonder about your position against the deployment of neoliberalism in universities.
The employment of?
Neoliberalism in universities.
Oh. Well, I suppose, again, I would need instruction in the situation in Turkey in terms of the economics departments, for example, at Boğaziçi, and in other universities in Turkey. I think that the hegemony of neoliberalism has weakened a great deal, in large part because we've seen the consequences of a narrow form of neoliberalism that has increased the concentration of wealth, that has stripped away a whole series of social protections for people. I don't know, I confess I don't know the degree to which Erdogan is a convert and prophet of neoliberalism himself. But I think it's fair to say that the narrow victory of Biden in the US is, to some degree, not entirely, a rejection of neoliberalism, or at least strong forms of neoliberalism. It would be incorrect to say neoliberalism is dead because it still rules the American political system, but it is no longer as hegemonic as it was, and it's because of the consequences that it has had in terms of jobs, social protection, and income inequality, and the idea that the market solves everything, which is nonsense. By the way, it's worth saying, I don't know if it's been translated into Turkish, but Herman Daly, who won the alternative prize in the Nobel economics, right? It's an alternative Nobel Prize for economics. He's written a textbook called Ecological Economics. And for those people who are interested in climate, ecology, and so on, less so in income equality, but it's a magnificent textbook that it would be hard after reading this textbook to subscribe to neoliberalism, because its consequences for social protection are bad enough, but its consequences for planetary resources and the climate are completely devastating.
Thank you. And I think we can ask you the last question here, and we can end this a great section.
Good. And good luck in your struggle. I will follow it. I will follow it more closely.
Thank you. Ebrar, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, I will ask the last question. Thank you, Professor Scott. Your time was very precious, and you share it with us. And I want to ask a question and edit mine. They are saying we encountered great oppression and violence during almost all our peaceful protests. What is the importance of using everyday forms of resistance or everyday weapons used by the weak against an oppression power? They are saying that. I'm asking this question. Would you like to or want me to repeat the question?
Please.
Okay. They are saying we encountered great oppression and violence during almost all our peaceful protests. What is the importance of using everyday forms of resistance or everyday weapons used by the weak against an oppressive power? In this case, they are referring to Boğaziçi University students because we are trying to use peaceful weapons, peaceful ways of resistance. And you were mentioning in different parts of your work, weapons of daily resistance. They're asking what is the importance of that way of resistance?
So there are kind of two questions as I understand it. One of them is the repression of peaceful protest. And it seems to me that one of the interesting things today is that everything is recorded by smartphones, cell phones, video, and so on. And I don't know whether the free media works well in terms of publicizing the brutal repression of what are obviously peaceful demonstrations, right? So if that is a possibility, it seems to me it speaks for itself, because people don't like to see people who are being peaceful beaten up. And to prevent that, of course, if both radio stations, TV stations, and newspapers will not carry that, then I'm wasting my time, because that would not be a successful way of delegitimating certain responses to peaceful protest. So it seems to me that in a sense, that depends on a kind of open media that will show the facts, the visual facts, to people. I think as a practical matter, that it's interesting. I just think that we in general are not as creative as we might be about forms of protest. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Gene Sharp's several volumes on nonviolent protest. He became actually a kind of prophetic figure for the Arab Spring, because he had published a kind of encyclopedia of forms of protest, right? And the millions of ways in which people found ways of expressing their both moral and political convictions in ways that were creative, that were funny. I mean, people are doing this all the time, of course, making jokes about Erdogan and I suppose all kinds of his clients and so on. But the point is that it seems to me that I'm all in favor of demonstrations, and they're extremely important because they're a public show of support and solidarity. And it means a lot to people to have that kinetic connection with a crowd that's interested in the same objectives and has the same moral position. So I think public demonstrations are extremely important. But it seems to me that to have them be the exclusive way in which one expresses opinions is to miss a whole continuum of forms of protest that are perhaps in the long run available to more people, that are often creative and embedded in the culture, whether it is art, whether it is plays that make fun of the military. I mean, even in China, under late Maoist period, people would put on ancient plays, and everybody understood that these ancient plays were a kind of criticism of a certain kind of autocracy. You didn't have to say it directly, but everyone understood that this was a form of opposition. And so anyway, I recommend Gene Sharp and his work because it is, if I were organizing forms of resistance as a full-time job, it would be my little encyclopedia that I would keep in my at my desk all the time.
Thank you for your speech and your answers. It was a great to be here and listen to you. And I want to announce that there will be 2 more events this night. One of them has been started, and the other will start in 9 p.m. in Turkey. And my friends sent their link. And if it is okay to you, we would like to take a picture for a memory. Let's smile.
Okay.
I think they took it. And
Okay,
thank you all of
good.
you to be here. And again, thank you, dear
Okay.
James Scott, to be here.
Thank you, and good luck with your struggle.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Evet, Profesör James C. Scott açık dersini gerçekleştirdi demokratik direniş üzerine. Ardından LGBT artı hareketinin kriminalleştirilmesi, boykot eylemi gibi konularda da sorularımızı cevapladı. Serbest yazının bugünkü açık dersi de bu kadardı. Bu akşam 2 açık ders daha olacak. Onları da YouTube'dan takip edebilirsiniz. Boğaziçi Direnişi kanalından. Ben Hale, Boğaziçi TV'den de aktaracaklarım bu kadardı. İzlediğiniz için teşekkür ediyorum. Diğer yayınlarımızda görüşmek üzere.